Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Come directly from the logbooks and testimonies of long-haul drivers who encountered something on our nation's most isolated roads that defies all explanation. From the phantom hitchhikers of Interstate 80 to the time-warping loops of US 50, each story represents a documented encounter with forces that patrol America's highways long after midnight. These are not urban legends passed down through truck stop coffee conversations, but verified incidents backed by dashcam footage, CB radio recordings, and official incident reports that trucking companies would prefer to keep buried. What makes these accounts particularly unsettling is their consistency across decades and thousands of miles of highway, suggesting that some roads never truly rest. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that explores the darkest mysteries lurking in plain sight. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we pull back the veil on America's most terrifying secrets. Now, let us merge onto the highways where reality breaks down and the impossible becomes inevitable, where every mile marker might be your last. The National Weather Service issued no warnings for Interstate 80 that night. Clear skies stretched endlessly above the Nevada desert, with visibility reported at over 10 miles and temperatures holding steady at a comfortable 62. For Marcus Rodriguez, a 4-year-old veteran of America's highways with 12 years of spotless driving records, it should have been just another routine run from Salt Lake City to Reno. His 2018 Peterbilt 579, meticulously maintained and equipped with every safety feature the company could afford, hummed steadily along the familiar stretch of asphalt. He had traveled more than 200 times. Marcus had always prided himself on preparation. His logbook entries were legendary among dispatchers for their precision, noting everything from fuel consumption rates to weather patterns. That October night, he had logged his departure from the Salt Lake Terminal exactly 9:47 p.m. His trailer loaded with electronics bound for California. The route was burned into his muscle memory. I-80 west through the Nevada desert, past Wendover, through the Salt Flats, and into the Sierra Nevada mountains. He knew every truck stop, every way station, and every mile marker between Utah and California. At 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes ahead of his projected schedule, Marcus passed mile marker 45 near the small desert town of Hock. The highway stretched before him like a ribbon of black glass, illuminated only by his LED headlights cutting through the darkness. His CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but for the most part, he was alone with his thoughts and the steady rhythm of his diesel engine. That is when he first saw her. At exactly 11:47 p.m., according to his truck's digital clock, an elderly woman appeared in his headlights near mile marker 48. She stood on shoulder of the highway, one arm raised in the universal gesture for help, her other hand clutching what appeared to be a small suitcase. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as he applied the brakes. The massive truck's air brakes hissing as he brought 18 tons of steel and cargo to a controlled stop roughly 50 yards past her position. Marcus had picked up stranded motorists before, though company policies strictly discouraged it. But something about this woman struck him as different. She appeared to be in her 70s, wearing a cream-colored dress that seemed oddly formal for a desert highway at midnight. Her grey hair was perfectly styled, despite the fact that she should have been wind-blown from standing beside the interstate. As he climbed down from his cab and approached her, he noticed she cast no shadow despite the powerful beam of his headlights. "Thank you for stopping, dear," she said, her voice carrying an unusual clarity that seemed to cut through the desert. Silence. "I have been waiting such a long time." Her accent was faintly European, possibly German. And when she smiled, Marcus noticed her teeth were perfectly white and straight, unusual for someone of her apparent age. "What happened to your car, ma'am?" Marcus asked, scanning the roadside for signs of a broken-down vehicle. There was nothing. No car, no truck, no motorcycle, just empty desert stretching in all directions. "Oh, there was an accident," she replied, adjusting her grip on the suitcase. "Such a terrible accident. But that was long ago. I need to get to Reno to see my daughter. She will be so worried." The woman's eyes had an odd quality to them, seeming to reflect light like an animal's, though Marcus attributed this to the angle of his headlights. Despite every safety protocol screaming against it, Marcus found himself agreeing to give her a ride. Something about her demeanor, her obvious distress, overrode his professional caution. He helped her up into the passenger seat of his cab, noting that her hand felt unusually cold, despite the warm desert air. She weighed almost nothing, as if she were made of air rather than flesh and bone. As they pulled back onto the highway, the woman began to speak about Reno, describing streets and buildings with remarkable detail. She mentioned the old Mapes Hotel, closed since 2000, as if it was still operating. She talked about taking the train to visit her daughter, though passenger rail service to Reno had been discontinued decades earlier. Marcus found her stories charming, if a bit confused, and attributed her apparent time displacement to age and stress from whatever accident had stranded her. 20 miles later, at mile marker 68, she suddenly pointed toward the right side of the highway. "You need to slow down here, dear. There's black ice ahead just past that curve. Very dangerous for a big truck like yours." Marcus glanced at his temperature gauge. It read 64, far too warm for ice formation. But something in her voice, an urgency that had not been there before, made him ease off the accelerator anyway. "Ma'am, it is too warm for ice tonight," he said gently, not wanting to contradict her, but feeling the need to explain the impossibility of her warning. "No, dear," she insisted, her voice now carrying a strange echo. "Trust me. I have seen what happens when drivers do not listen." As she spoke, Marcus glanced at his passenger seat and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The seat was empty. The elderly woman had vanished completely, leaving behind only the faintest scent of old-fashioned perfume in a small wet spot on the seat where she had been sitting. Marcus slammed on his brakes, his mind reeling. He had been talking to her just seconds before. She could not have simply disappeared from a moving truck cab 60 feet above the ground. He pulled over immediately, searching every inch of his cab with a flashlight. Nothing. No sign that anyone had ever been there except for that damp spot on the passenger seat and the lingering scent of lilacs. Shaken but determined to reach his destination, Marcus pulled back onto the highway. As he approached the curve she had warned him about, his headlights revealed something that made his hands tremble on the steering wheel. A thin sheet of black ice covered the asphalt for nearly a 4 mile, invisible until the light hit it at just the right angle. At the speed he had been traveling, his loaded truck would have jackknifed immediately, likely sending him over the embankment into the desert below. He navigated the ice carefully, his truck's traction control system engaging multiple times as his wheels fought for grip on the treacherous surface. Once safely past the hazard, he grabbed his CB radio with shaking hands. "Breaker 1 in this is Desert Runner eastbound at mile marker 70. Be advised, there's black ice on the westbound side just past the curve. Repeat, black ice on westbound I-80 at mile marker 69. The responses came immediately. "Thanks for the heads up, Desert Runner. How did you spot it in this weather?" Asked a driver heading west. Marcus paused, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. "Just got lucky, I guess," he replied, though luck seemed an inadequate explanation for his supernatural passenger. Marcus completed his run to Reno without further incident, but he could not shake the memory of the elderly woman. The next morning, while his truck was being unloaded, he visited the Nevada Highway Patrol office and described his encounter. The desk sergeant, a weathered man named Patterson, who had worked the I-80 corridor for 15 years, listened with growing interest. "What did she look like exactly?" Patterson asked, pulling out a thick file folder. Marcus described the woman in detail: her cream-colored dress, her perfectly styled grey hair, her slight European accent, and her obsession with visiting her daughter in Reno. Patterson nodded slowly and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, "Elderly woman dies in I-80 accident near Hock." The accompanying photograph showed the same woman Marcus had picked up, down to the cream-colored dress and small suitcase. According to the article, Elena Hoffman, age 73, had been killed instantly when her 1983 Buick sedan hit black ice and rolled over near mile marker 48. She had been traveling to Reno to visit her daughter when the accident occurred. "She appears every few years," Patterson explained, "always near mile marker 48, always warning drivers about hazardous conditions ahead. We have had at least a dozen reports over the years, all describing the same woman wearing the same dress. Some drivers think she's just a confused hitchhiker until she vanishes from their cab. Others never see her at all." Patterson showed Marcus photographs off the accident site from 1987. The twisted wreckage of Eleanor's Buick was scattered across the same stretch of highway where Marcus had found black ice the night before. "The strange thing is," Patterson continued, "she only appears when there really is danger ahead. Every driver who has reported seeing her was saved from some kind of hazard. Ice, washouts, drunk drivers, mechanical failures. It is like she's still trying to complete that last trip to see her daughter." Marcus left the Highway Patrol office with a profound sense of unease mixed with gratitude. He had been saved by a ghost, protected by a woman who had died trying to make the same journey he completed every week. Over the following months, he began to research Eleanor Hoffman's story more thoroughly. He discovered that her daughter Margaret had waited at the Reno bus station for 3 days after the accident, not knowing her mother had died. Eleanor had been carrying Christmas presents in her suitcase, gifts she never got to deliver. The trucking community, typically skeptical of supernatural claims, began to take notice when Marcus shared his story. Other drivers came forward with similar experiences on the same stretch of highway. A pattern emerged. Eleanor appeared only to drivers who were in genuine danger, and only when weather conditions created the same black ice that had killed her. She never spoke of her own death, never acknowledged her ghostly state, but continued her eternal journey to Reno, helping others avoid her fate. Marcus commissioned a small memorial stone to be placed near mile marker 48 with Elena's name, and the simple inscription, "A guardian angel of the highway." The memorial became an unofficial shrine where truckers would leave flowers, coffee, and small tokens of respect. Company drivers began reporting unusual experiences near the site. CB radios crackling with warnings in a woman's voice, mysterious figures flagging them down only to vanish, and an inexplicable urge to slow down and check their surroundings. The Nevada Department of Transportation, initially skeptical of the reports, eventually acknowledged the Eleanor Hoffman phenomenon. In their safety briefings, they installed additional warning signs near mile marker 48 and increased winter maintenance in the area. The stretch of highway where she died became one of the safest sections of Interstate 80, not through advanced technology or increased enforcement, but through the protective presence of a woman who refused to let her final journey end in tragedy. Today, veteran drivers still tell newcomers about Eleanor Hoffman, the phantom hitchhiker of Interstate 80. They advise listening carefully to elderly passengers who appear suddenly in the Nevada desert, especially those traveling to see family. "She saved my life," Marcus tells other drivers at truck stops along his route. And she is still out there, still trying to get home, still making sure others make it safely, too. The highway patrol file on Elena Halfman remains open, not as an unsolved case, but as a testament to the enduring bonds between the living and the dead on America's loneliest roads. Her story serves as a reminder that some journeys transcend death itself, and that the highways that connect our nation are traveled by more than just the living. According to his fuel log, Jake Morrison should have been in Denver by sunrise. The meticulous records that defined his 15-year career as an owner-operator showed a full tank of diesel purchased at 11:30 p.m. in Pueblo, enough fuel for the 120 meters run to his destination with 40 gold to spare. His GPS unit displayed an estimated arrival time of 4:45 a.m., accounting for construction delays and his self-imposed speed limits. But when the sun crested the Rocky Mountains that October morning, Jake Morrison was still driving the same stretch of US Highway 50 he had entered 6 hours earlier, his fuel gauge reading nearly empty, and his odometer showing an impossible 847 additional miles on what should have been a routine overnight haul. Jake Morrison was not a man prone to confusion or error. At 41 years old, he had built his reputation on precision and reliability, earning contracts with companies that demanded both punctuality and meticulous documentation. His 2019 Kenworth W900L was equipped with every tracking device and monitoring system available, from electronic logging devices that recorded his every movement to dash cameras that captured both the road ahead and his reactions behind the wheel. He maintained detailed paper logs as backup, noting fuel consumption, weather conditions, and road hazards with the thoroughness of a scientist conducting an experiment. That night began like hundreds of others. Jake departed the Flying J truck stop in Pueblo exactly 11:47 p.m., his trailer loaded with machine parts, bound for a manufacturing plant in Denver. As Highway 50 West stretched before him, a familiar ribbon of asphalt he had traveled more than 300 times over his career. The route was burned into his muscle memory, past the Colorado State Fairgrounds, through Fowler and Manzanola, then northwest toward Colorado Springs, before connecting to Interstate 25 north into Denver. The night was clear and cold, with temperatures hovering near freezing and no precipitation in the forecast. Traffic was light, consisting mainly of other commercial vehicles making their overnight runs. Jake settled into his usual rhythm, cruise control set at exactly 67 miles per hour, CB radio tuned to channel 19 for traffic updates, and his favorite country music station providing background noise for the journey ahead. At 12:23 a.m., Jake passed through the small town of Rocky Ford, noting the time and location in his logbook. As required by company protocol, the town's main street was deserted except for a few pickup trucks parked outside a 24-hour diner, their drivers probably grabbing coffee before continuing their own late-night journeys. Nothing seemed unusual or noteworthy about the familiar landmarks. The grain elevator rising against the star-filled sky, the railroad crossing that always required a careful approach, the billboard advertising a local auto dealer that had been there for as long as Jake had been driving this route. 20 minutes later at 12:43 a.m. Jake passed through Rocky Ford again. The realization did not hit him immediately. Long-haul drivers develop a kind of highway hypnosis, a state where familiar routes become background noise to their thoughts. Jake initially attributed the repeated sightings to fatigue or inattention. Perhaps he had passed another small Colorado town with similar features. But when he checked his GPS unit, the display showed his exact location as Rocky Ford, Colorado at mile marker 43 on US Highway 50 West, the same coordinates he had logged. 20 minutes earlier, Jake pulled over at the next wide spot on the shoulder and examined his equipment carefully. His GPS unit showed no error messages. Its satellite connection remained strong with accuracy readings of plus or minus 3 feet. His odometer had advanced exactly 20.7 miles since his last Rocky Ford sighting, precisely the distance he would expect to travel at his recorded speed over that time period. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was in the exact same location he had been before, looking at the same diner, the same grain elevator, the same billboard advertising trucks he would never need. Attributing the anomaly to a GPS malfunction, Jake consulted his paper road atlas, a habit that had saved him from electronic failures countless times over his career. According to the map, US Highway 50 West ran in a straight line through Rocky Ford toward La Junta with no loops, circles, or alternate routes that could explain his apparent displacement. He traced the route with his finger, confirming that the highway continued northwest in a direct path toward his destination. Jake resumed driving, paying closer attention to landmarks and mile markers. He passed the Rocky Ford city limit sign at 12:51 a.m., noting the exact time in his logbook. The grain elevator receded in his mirrors as expected, and the familiar sequence of rural landmarks rolled past his windshield. An abandoned farmhouse with a distinctive red barn, a concrete bridge over an irrigation canal, a cluster of mailboxes, as a dirt road intersection that locals used to access their properties. At 1:11 a.m., Jake saw the abandoned farmhouse with the distinctive red barn approaching in his headlights. This time, there was no mistaking what was happening. Jake had memorized every detail of that farmhouse during his previous passage. The way the barn door hung askew, the pattern of broken windows in the main structure, the old water tower leaning at a precarious angle behind the buildings. These were not similar buildings in another location. These were the exact same structures he had observed 20 minutes earlier, despite having driven continuously in a straight line for the intervening period. Jake grabbed his CB radio with hands that had begun to shake. Breaker 1N. This is Jake. Morrison running westbound on Highway 50. Can any drivers out there confirm your location for me? The radio crackled with static before a familiar voice responded. This is Desert Rose eastbound on 50. Just passed through La Junta about 10 minutes ago. Where you at, Jake? The voice belonged to Maria Santos, a driver Jake had known for years, who ran regular routes between Kansas and Colorado. I think I am stuck in some kind of loop near Rocky Ford, Jake replied, realizing how insane the words sounded even as he spoke them. I keep passing the same landmarks over and over. Have you ever heard of anything like this happening? The CB remained silent for nearly a minute before Maria's voice returned, sounding concerned. Jake, you feeling okay? Maybe you should pull over and get some rest. These overnight runs can mess with your head sometimes. But Jake knew this was not fatigue or hallucination. His truck systems were functioning normally. His mind was clear and alert, and the physical evidence of his situation was undeniable. He began documenting everything with obsessive detail. Timestamps for every landmark, photographs of his GPS display, voice recordings describing each anomaly. If this was some kind of breakdown, at least there would be evidence for investigators to examine. At 1:31 a.m., Jake passed through Rocky Ford for the third time. The town looked exactly as it had during his previous passages, down to the arrangement of pickup trucks outside the diner and the burned-out street light near the railroad crossing. But this time, Jake noticed something that chilled him to the bone. His own truck appeared in the diner's parking lot, a perfect duplicate of his Kenworth W9OL, complete with his company's logo and his personal call sign painted on the door. Jake pulled into the lot and parked beside what appeared to be his own vehicle. The duplicate truck was identical in every detail. Same scratches on the bumper, same mud pattern on the tires, even the same small dent in the passenger door from a minor incident 3 years earlier. The trailer bore the same load number and destination information displayed on his own equipment, but the cab was empty. No driver visible behind the darkened windshield. Jake climbed out of his truck and approached the duplicate vehicle, his breath visible in the cold mountain air. The truck appeared solid and real, casting shadows under the parking lot lights and reflecting his image in its polished chrome surfaces. He placed his hand on the hood and felt the warmth of an engine that had been running recently. The fuel tank showed the same level as his own truck, and when he looked through the driver's side window, he saw his own logbook lying open on the passenger seat, filled with entries in his own handwriting documenting the same impossible journey he was experiencing. Panic began to set in as Jake realized he was trapped in some kind of temporal or spatial anomaly that defied rational explanation. He tried calling his dispatcher on his cell phone, but the call went directly to voicemail despite showing full signal strength. Text messages failed to send, and his internet connection, while showing as active, would not load any websites or applications. He was isolated in a bubble of unreality, cut off from the normal flow of time and space. Jake returned to his truck and continued driving, hoping that forward motion might somehow break whatever force was holding him this recursive nightmare. He drove with mechanical precision, maintaining exact speed and direction while documenting every repetition of the familiar landmarks. Each loop took exactly 20 minutes and covered exactly 20.7 miles, bringing him back to Rocky Ford with the mathematical precision of a clock mechanism. On his fourth passage through town, Jake noticed that the clock on the diner's exterior sign was running backwards, its hands moving counterclockwise at normal speed. The radio in his truck began picking up broadcasts from decades past, 1970s country music, news reports about events from the 1980s, weather forecasts for dates that had already occurred. Time itself seemed to be flowing in reverse within the boundaries of his endless loop, as if he had been caught in some kind of temporal whirlpool that recycled the same moments over and over. By his sixth repetition, Jake began encountering other versions of himself. He would see his truck approaching from the opposite direction, driven by a figure that looked exactly like him, but never acknowledged his presence. Sometimes he would pass multiple duplicate trucks, a convoy of Jake Morrisons, all trapped in the same impossible journey, all seemingly unaware of each other's existence. The sight of his own face behind the wheel of another truck staring straight ahead with the blank expression of someone caught in highway hypnosis filled him with existential terror that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think rationally. Jake tried breaking the pattern by stopping, completely turning around, taking different routes through Rocky Ford, even abandoning his truck and walking along the highway. Nothing worked. Every attempt to deviate from the established loop would somehow result in his returning to his truck and finding himself back on US Highway 50, approaching the same landmarks in the same sequence. The universe seemed determined to keep him locked in this 20-minute segment of highway, a record player stuck on the same groove. As the night wore on, Jake began to understand that he was not just trapped in space, but caught in a recursive loop of time itself. Each repetition was not just a return to the same location, but a return to the same moment, playing out the same sequence of events, with only his growing awareness marking any difference between iterations. He was experiencing the same 20 minutes over and over, accumulating memories and knowledge, while the world around him reset to its initial state. The fuel gauge on his truck remained mysteriously consistent despite hours of driving. According to his calculations, he should have run out of diesel before his third loop, but the tank level never changed from the 3/4 full reading it had shown when the anomaly began. Time was not affecting his truck in the normal way, as if the entire system of cause and effect had been suspended within the boundaries of his prison. At exactly 3:33 a.m., on Jake's 17th repetition of the loop, he made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing to drive forward in the hope of breaking free, he brought this truck to a complete stop in the middle of US Highway 50 and turned off the engine. He sat in absolute silence for the first time since entering the anomaly, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through his partially open window. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, The familiar sounds of his diesel engine, the hum of tires on asphalt, the background noise of his CB radio, all fell silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, and the shallow rhythm of his breathing in the enclosed space of his cab. He waited, counting seconds and then minutes, determined to remain motionless until something changed, or until he understood the nature of his imprisonment. At exactly 3:33 a.m., something shifted. The oppressive sense of repetition and recycling that had defined his night suddenly lifted, like a weight being removed from his chest. Jake felt reality snap back into its normal configuration, and when he looked at his GPS display, it showed his location as mile marker for 123 on US Highway 50, 17 miles past Rocky Ford, and exactly where he should have been if he had been driving normally for the past 4 hours. Jake started his engine and continued toward Denver, his hands still shaking from the experience. His fuel gauge now showed the expected consumption for the distance he had traveled, and his CB radio picked up normal traffic from other drivers, making their morning runs. The world had returned to its familiar patterns of cause and effect, but Jake carried with him the memory of those impossible hours when time itself had become unstuck. When Jake reached his destination in Denver, he found that his delivery was exactly on schedule, despite his subjective experience of being trapped for over 4 hours. According to every clock, GPS system, and logbook entry, his journey from Pueblo had taken the normal amount of time with no unexplained delays or detours. The only evidence of his ordeal was his own memory and the photographs he had taken of his GPS displayed during the loops. Images that now showed normal readings with no trace of the anomalous coordinates he had documented. Jake filed a report with his company about experiencing navigation difficulties near Rocky Ford, but he never fully explained what had happened to him at US Highway 50. He continued driving the same route for several more months, but each time he approached Rocky Ford, he would grip his steering wheel a little tighter and watch his clocks more carefully, remembering the night when time itself had trapped him in an endless repetition of the same 20 minutes. Other drivers began reporting similar experiences on the same stretch of highway: missing time, repeated landmarks, the sensation of driving in circles despite maintaining a straight course. The Colorado Department of Transportation eventually acknowledged receiving multiple reports of navigation anomalies near Rocky Ford, though they attributed the incidents to GPS interference from nearby military installations, rather than admitting the possibility that US Highway 50 contained a genuine temporal anomaly. Jake Morrison never experienced another loop, but he never forgot the terror of being trapped in time's recursive grip, forever driving the same stretch of haunted highway, while reality recycled around him, a broken record that refused to move to the next song. Breaker and anyone else seeing this convoy ahead. Those were the words that crackled through Linda Washington's CB radio at 3:17 a.m. on Interstate 40, somewhere between Gallup and Grants, New Mexico. The voice belonged to a driver she had never heard before, tinged with an accent that sounded like it came from another decade. Linda checked her mirrors and scanned the dark highway ahead, seeing nothing but empty asphalt stretching toward the distant mountains under a canopy of stars that seemed unusually bright that November night. Linda Washington, at 28 years old, represented the second generation of Washington family truckers. Her father had driven these same southwestern routes in the 1970s and 1980s, sharing stories of the old days when CB radios were the only connection between drivers, and the highway felt more dangerous and mysterious than it did in the modern era of GPS tracking and satellite communication. As a Cherokee woman who had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about spirits that walked the ancient paths, Linda maintained a respectful awareness of forces that most drivers dismissed as superstition or imagination. Her 2017 Freightliner Cascadia was equipped with every modern convenience and safety system available. From collision avoidance technology to electronic lodging devices that tracked her every movement for regulatory compliance. The truck represented the pinnacle of contemporary engineering, designed to eliminate the uncertainties and dangers that had made her father's generation of drivers into folk heroes and cautionary tales. But on this particular night, traveling through the heart of Navajo Nation territory are a route that paralleled ancient trading paths used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Linda would discover that some roads remember their history in ways that no amount of modern technology can override. The run from Phoenix to Oklahoma City was routine work, a freight route she had completed dozens of times over her 3 years as an owner-operator. Her trailer carried consumer electronics bound for distribution centers in the Midwest, valuable cargo that required careful attention to schedules and security protocols. Linda prided herself on maintaining the cultural traditions her grandmother had taught her. Even while embracing the technological demands of modern trucking, she carried sage and sweetgrass in her cap, offered tobacco to the spirits at certain sacred sites, and always acknowledged the land she traveled through as the traditional territory of the tribes who had called it home for centuries. At 3:23 a.m., Linda crested a long rise in the highway and saw them, a line of tail lights stretching across the horizon like red stars falling to earth. The convoy appeared to consist of at least 20 vehicles, their lights forming a perfect procession, moving westbound in the distance. What struck Linda immediately as unusual was a spacing between the trucks, much closer together than modern safety regulations would allow, and the uniformity of their light patterns, suggesting vehicles from an earlier era when lighting configurations were different from current standards. Linda reached for her CB radio to respond to the earlier transmission. Breaker 19. This is Cherokee Rose westbound on I-40 near mile marker 120. I can confirm visual on that convoy you mentioned. You still got eyes on them. The radio crackled with static for several seconds before the same voice responded. Clearer now, but carrying an odd quality that seemed to echo slightly as if the transmission were bouncing off distant mountains. Roger that, Cherokee Rose. They are running hard, maybe 75, 80 miles per hour. Never seen anything like it. They're not responding to radio calls, and I cannot make out any company markings on their trailers. The voice paused and Linda could hear what sounded like wind rushing through the transmission. There is something else, Cherokee Rose. They are running without any running lights, just tail lights. No marker lights, no clearance lights, like they are trying to stay invisible. As Linda maintained her position on the highway, gradually closing the distance to the mysterious convoy, she began to notice details that challenged her understanding of what she was witnessing. The trucks ahead appeared to be models from the 1950s or early 1960s, their distinctive shapes and proportions clearly visible in her headlights when she occasionally gained ground on the formation. The trailers were shorter and narrower than modern equipment, and she could see the characteristic rounded edges and chrome details that marked vehicles from a bygone era of American trucking. Her CB radio began picking up multiple voices, all seemingly part of the convoy's communication network. The chatter was unlike anything had ever heard on contemporary CB frequencies. The drivers used terminology and 10 codes that predated current standards, referring to locations by names that had not been used for decades. They spoke of fuel stops and truck stops that Linda knew had been closed or demolished years earlier, discussing routes and schedules with the casual familiarity of drivers who had traveled these roads many times before. Breaker for the Shadow Fleet. This is Desert, Ghost running drag. We got company behind us. Cherokee Rose in a white freightliner. Should we make room for her to pass? The transmission came through so clearly that Linda could hear the distinctive sound of an older diesel engine in the background, along with wind noise that suggested open windows. Despite the cold November air, Linda felt a chill run down her spine at the reference to Shadow Fleet, a term she had never heard in trucking circles, but which carried ominous connotations. Her grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of spirit travelers who moved between worlds, sometimes visible to the living and sometimes not, always traveling ancient paths that connected sacred sites and places of power. Interstate 40 had been built over portions of historic Route 66, which itself had followed trade routes and pathways that indigenous peoples had used for countless generations. "This is Cherokee Rose to Desert Ghost," Linda transmitted, her voice steady despite the growing unease she felt. "I am not looking to pass, just maintaining my schedule. You all running a special convoy tonight?" The question hung in the air for nearly a minute before Desert Ghost responded, his voice carrying a note of sadness that seemed to come from decades of weariness. "We are always running Cherokee Rose, been running the same route since 1952, trying to finish what we started. Some races never end, even when all the drivers are gone." The transmission faded into static, leaving Linda with more questions than answers and a growing realization that she was witnessing something that existed outside the normal boundaries of space and time. Linda activated her truck's dash camera and began documenting what she was seeing, narrating her observations for later review. The convoy maintained its formation with mathematical precision, each truck exactly the same distance from the vehicles, ahead and behind, their speed synchronized to the degree that suggested either supernatural coordination or a level of driving skill that bordered on the impossible. As she watched, the lead trucks began to navigate curves and grades with movements that seemed choreographed, as if they were all responding to the same invisible conductor. Her research into New Mexico trucking history during a rest break later that night would reveal the tragic backstory that gave the Shadow Fleet its name and purpose. In 1952, a convoy of independent truckers had attempted to set a speed record for crossing New Mexico, racing from the Arizona border to the Texas line. In a publicity stunt designed to promote a new freight company, the convoy consisted of 21 trucks, all driven by experienced drivers who believed their skill and preparation would allow them to safely maintain dangerous speeds across the desert highways. The race had ended in disaster near the location where Linda encountered the Phantom convoy. A combination of mechanical failures, driver fatigue, and treacherous road conditions had resulted in a multi-vehicle accident that claimed the lives of 13 drivers and destroyed most of the participating trucks. The survivors had never spoken publicly about what happened that night, and the freight company had dissolved within months of the tragedy, its reputation destroyed by the negative publicity surrounding the deaths. But the spirits of those lost drivers had apparently stopped racing. Local tribal elders whom Linda contacted confirmed that the area had a long history of supernatural encounters, with travelers reporting ghost lights, phantom vehicles, and the sounds of engines and CB radio chatter coming from empty highways. The Navajo Nation had recorded similar stories going back to the early days of automobile travel, suggesting that certain stretches of road held on to the memories and emotions of those who had died violently while traveling through their territory. Linda continued to observe the convoy. She began to notice that the trucks appeared to be aging in reverse, their condition gradually improving, as if time were moving backward for them. Chrome that had initially appeared tarnished began to gleam. Paint that had looked faded started to shine, and mechanical sounds that had seemed rough and worn became smoother and more powerful. It was as if the convoy was moving not just through space, but through time, heading back toward the moment when there had been new trucks with living drivers pursuing dreams of success and recognition. The CB chatter became more intense as the night progressed, with the phantom drivers discussing details of their planned route, fuel consumption calculations, and strategic decisions about when to push their speeds and when to exercise caution. Linda realized she was listening to conversations that had originally taken place over 70 years earlier, replayed endlessly as the drivers attempted to complete their interrupted journey. The voices carried the confidence and optimism of men who believed they were making history, unaware that their race would end in tragedy. Cherokee Rose, This is Desert Ghost again. We are approaching the crossing point soon. If you want to honor the old ways, now would be the time to show respect. The transmission was accompanied by coordinates that Linda recognized as a sacred site her grandmother had told her about. Place where multiple ancient trails intersected, and where offerings should be made to ensure safe travel. Linda pulled over at the next wide spot and retrieved the sage and tobacco she would for such occasions. Following the protocols her grandmother had taught her, she made an offering to the spirits of the lost drivers, acknowledging their sacrifice and asking for their protection of all who travel the dangerous highways of the Southwest. As she completed the ceremony, the convoy gradually faded from view, their taillights becoming dimmer and more distant until they merged with the stars and disappeared entirely. The CB radio fell silent except for the occasional transmission from living drivers making their own late-night runs across the desert. Linda returned to her truck with a profound sense of having witnessed something sacred and terrible. A glimpse into the persistence of human will and ambition beyond the boundaries of life and death. The Shadow Fleet would continue their eternal race forever, seeking to complete the journey that had cost them their lives, serving as both a warning and a source of protection for other drivers who traveled the haunted highways of the American Southwest. Linda completed her run to Oklahoma City without further supernatural encounters, but she carried the memory of the Shadow Fleet with her. As she returned to regular freight routes across the region, she began researching similar phenomena reported by other Native American drivers, discovering a network of stories and experiences that suggested the highways of the Southwest were populated by far more than just living travelers. The roads remembered their dead, and sometimes on the darkest nights when conditions were right, the paths came rushing back to offer guidance, warnings, and reminders of the dangers that had always lurked on the edges of America's transportation networks. The Cherokee Rose became a regular contributor to a CB channel dedicated to supernatural encounters on southwestern highways, sharing her experience with the Shadow Fleet and learning from other drivers who had witnessed similar phenomena. Together they formed an informal network of observers and protectors, people who understood that respecting the spirits of the road was just as important as maintaining their equipment and following safety regulations. Today, drivers traveling Interstate 40 through New Mexico still report encounters with vintage truck convoys that appear and disappear without explanation, their CB radios crackling with voices from another era, discussing routes, schedules, and dreams that ended in tragedy decades ago. The Shadow Fleet continues to race toward a finish line they will never reach, forever trapped in their final journey, but still offering guidance and protection to the living drivers who share their eternal highway. There was nothing wrong with Tommy Chen's odometer. The comprehensive inspection report, filed by Roadmaster Truck Services in Santa Fe on November 8, 2023, confirmed that every system in his 2020 Peterbilt 389 functioned within manufacturer specifications. The digital odometer had been calibrated just 3 weeks earlier as part of his annual DOT inspection. Its accuracy verified to within 1/10 of a mile across standardized test distances. Yet, according to the maintenance logs Tommy meticulously kept, his truck had somehow gained 347 miles during what should have been a routine 89 miles run from Santa Fe to Roswell, New Mexico along US Highway 2, 85 South. Tommy Chen had earned his mechanical engineering degree from UC Berkeley before the economic downturn of 2008 forced him to reconsider his career path. Trucking had initially been a temporary solution, a way to pay bills while searching for engineering work, but 15 years later, he had built a successful owner-operator business based on his analytical approach to the industry. Where other drivers relied on intuition and experience, Tommy used data and scientific methodology to optimize every aspect of his operations. From fuel efficiency calculations to route planning algorithms he had developed himself. His truck reflected this methodical mindset. The cab was equipped with multiple GPS units for redundancy, electronic logging devices that recorded his position every minute, and a comprehensive array of monitoring equipment that tracked everything, from tire pressure to engine temperature. Tommy maintained detailed spreadsheets documenting fuel consumption, maintenance schedules, and performance metrics that would have impressed his former engineering colleagues. He approached trucking as a science, believing that enough data and careful analysis could eliminate uncertainty and risk from even the most unpredictable profession. That November night began with Tommy's standard pre-trip inspection checklist, a 47-point examination that he conducted religiously before every departure. His trailer contained precision laboratory equipment, bound for the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in SAK or O. Cargo, that required climate control and vibration monitoring throughout the journey. The route along US Highway 285 was straightforward, a well-maintained highway that cut directly south through the high desert country of central New Mexico, passing through small communities like Lamy, Calasto, and Vaughan before reaching its destination. At 10:47 p.m., Tommy departed the Santa Fe terminal with his odometer reading exactly 847,329, 7 miles, a figure he recorded in his logbook along with fuel levels, tire pressures, and weather conditions. The night was clear and cold, with temperatures dropping toward freezing and no precipitation expected. His GPS unit showed the standard route south on US Highway 285 with an estimated travel time of 2 hours and 12 minutes to reach the observatory facilities. The first sign that something was wrong came 11:23 p.m. when Tommy passed mile marker 347 heading south. According to his GPS calculations and previous experience, he should have encountered mile marker 341 at that point in his journey, having traveled approximately 36 miles from Santa Fe. Tommy pulled over to check his GPS units, assuming one of them had malfunctioned or lost satellite signal. All 3 devices showed consistent readings, placing him at the correct coordinates for mile marker 347 on a Highway 285 south. But the mathematics did not add up to his known starting point and elapsed travel time. Tommy consulted his detailed road atlas, a habit that had served him well during GPS failures and construction detours throughout his career. The atlas confirmed that mile markers on US Highway 285 should indeed decrease as he traveled south from Santa Fe, with the numbering system starting from the Colorado border and counting down toward the Texas line. Yet, the physical mile marker he had just passed clearly displayed 347 in standard Department of Transportation font and format, exactly matching the appearance of legitimate highway markers he had observed throughout his career. Assuming he had somehow misread the marker in the darkness, Tommy continued south while paying closer attention to the numbering sequence. At 11:31 p.m., he passed mile marker 348.8 minutes later. He encountered mile marker 349. The mile markers were counting upward rather than downward, suggesting he was traveling north despite maintaining a consistent southerly heading according to his compass and GPS units. Tommy stopped his truck at the next wide spot on the shoulder and conducted a systematic check of all his navigation equipment. His magnetic compass pointed steadily south, confirmed by a digital compass app on his smartphone that used the device's internal magnetometer. His 3 GPS units showed consistent coordinates, indicating southbound travel on US Highway 285 with his position tracking steadily toward his destination in Socorro. The stars visible through his windshield maintained their expected positions relative to his direction of travel, confirming that he was indeed heading south across the New Mexico landscape. Yet the mile markers continued to count in the wrong direction. Tommy reached for his CB radio to contact other drivers who might be traveling the same route. Breaker 1 This is Pacific Engineer southbound on Highway 285 near mile marker 350. Can anyone confirm the mile marker sequence on this highway? I am seeing numbers that do not match my expectations. The radio crackled with static before a voice responded, though the quality was oddly distorted, as if the transmission were coming from a great distance or through atmospheric interference. Pacific Engineer, this is Desert Scholar. I have been traveling Highway 285 for 37 years, and I have never seen mile markers behave the way they are tonight. They're counting backwards from where I started, even though I'm traveling in the same direction I always have. The voice carried a note of confusion that Tommy found both reassuring and disturbing. At least he was not the only driver experiencing navigational anomalies. As Tommy continued south, the mile marker sequence became increasingly surreal. He passed marker 351, then 352, then 353, each one confirming that distance was somehow being measured in reverse of its normal progression. More disturbing was the gradual change in his surroundings. The landscape outside his windows began to shift subtly, as if he were traveling not just through space, but through time. Modern road construction gave way to older asphalt and concrete. Highway signs displayed fonts and designs from previous decades, and the few buildings visible in the distance appeared to be aging backward, their architecture becoming more contemporary as he progressed. Tommy activated his truck's dash camera system and began documenting the anomaly, narrating his observations for later analysis. Time is 11:47 p.m. Odometer reading 847,365 for 4 miles, approximately 36 miles from starting point, but mile markers indicate position 354 and continuing to increase. GPS coordinates remain consistent with southbound travel on correct highway, but physical evidence suggests movement through temporal as well as spatial dimensions. His radio began picking up broadcasts that seemed to originate from different time periods, music from the 1960s and 1970s mixed with news reports about events Tommy remembered from his childhood, with the forecasts for dates that had already occurred, and traffic reports for highway conditions from decades in the past. The voices sounded authentic, for the nostalgic recreations, carrying the casual immediacy of live broadcasts rather than archived recordings. At mile marker 359, Tommy encountered something that challenged his scientific worldview. Fundamental ways. Another truck approached from the opposite direction, heading north toward Santa Fe. As the vehicle passed under his headlights, Tommy recognized the exact specifications and appearance of his own Peterbilt 389, down to the distinctive paint scheme and company logos he had chosen for his business identity. Behind the wheel sat a figure that looked exactly like Tommy himself, but younger, wearing clothing styles from several years earlier, and displaying the confident expression of someone who had not yet encountered the impossible. The encounter lasted only seconds, but Tommy caught a glimpse of the other driver's logbook lying open on the passenger seat. The pages appeared to contain entries in his own handwriting, documenting trips and destinations from earlier in his career, when he had been establishing his business and learning the nuances of a long-haul trucking. It was as if he had passed a younger version of himself, traveling the same highway during an earlier period of his life. Tommy immediately grabbed his CB radio. Desert Scholar, this is Pacific Engineer. Did you see that northbound Peterbilt that just passed me? It looked exactly like my truck driven by someone who looked exactly like me. The response came quickly, tinged with excitement and fear. Pacific Engineer, I have been seeing multiple versions of my own truck tonight, all traveling in different directions at different points along this highway. Each one represents a different period of my career, like photographs from my past spread out across the road. I think we are traveling through time as well as distance. As the night progressed, Tommy began to understand that US Highway 285 had somehow become unstuck from normal temporal progression. The backward counting mile markers were not just indicating reverse distance measurement, but reverse time flow, taking him deeper into his own past with each mile traveled. his truck systems continued to function normally within their local framework. But the highway itself existed in a state of temporal flux that allowed past, present, and future to coexist in the same physical space. Tommy encountered multiple versions of himself throughout the night, each representing a different stage of his trucking career. He saw himself as a nervous rookie learning to handle mountain grades, as a confident mid-career driver, optimizing routes and building customer relationships, and his various intermediate points in his professional development. Each encounter provided glimpses into decisions he had made, challenges he had overcome, and the gradual evolution of his approach to the trucking industry. The radio chatter became a cacophony of voices from different eras, with drivers from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and beyond, all communicating simultaneously across the temporal boundaries that normally separated their experiences. Tommy listened to conversations about fuel prices from decades past, discussions of regulations that had long since been repealed or modified, and debates about technology that was now obsolete. It was as if US Highway 285 had become a repository for every conversation, every journey, and every moment that had ever occurred on its length. At mile marker 381, Tommy made a crucial decision. Instead of continuing to travel backward through time, he brought his truck to a complete stop and began conducting systematic measurements of his situation. He used his engineering training to document the temporal anomaly with scientific precision, recording coordinates, timestamps, atmospheric conditions, and equipment readings that might help explain how a stretch of highway could violate the fundamental laws of physics. Tommy's measurements revealed that time was not flowing at a consistent rate throughout the affected area. His digital clocks ran at different speeds depending on his exact position on the highway, sometimes faster and sometimes slower than normal temporal progression. The odometer's backward counting was not a malfunction, but an accurate representation of movement through reverse time, measuring distance traveled into the past rather than toward a geographic destination. The most significant discovery came when Tommy realized that the temporal distortion was centered on a specific coordinate, approximately 15 miles south of Santa Fe, near the site of a major traffic accident that had occurred in 1987. According to newspaper archives, he later accessed a collision between multiple vehicles, including several trucks, had resulted in numerous fatalities and had led to significant changes in highway design and safety protocols. The accident had been blamed on a combination of factors, including driver fatigue, inadequate lighting, and confusing mile marker placement that had been corrected in subsequent road improvements. Tommy theorized that the temporal anomaly represented a kind of temporal scar, a place where traumatic events had damaged the normal flow of time and created a recursive loop that trapped travelers in cycles of past experience. The backward mile markers and time distortion were not random phenomena, but were centered on the anniversary date of the original accident, creating conditions that allowed past and present to overlap in dangerous ways. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time that the 1987 accident had occurred, Tommy felt reality shift around him. The temporal distortion suddenly collapsed and normal time flow resumed. His odometer jumped forward to show the correct mileage for his actual location, his GPS unit synchronized with his physical position, and the mile markers began counting in the proper direction. The radio chatter from previous decades faded away, replaced by normal traffic from contemporary drivers making their own late-night runs across New Mexico. Tommy completed his delivery to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, but he never forgot his journey through time on US Highway 285. He filed detailed reports with the New Mexico Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Though his scientific documentation was dismissed as driver fatigue and equipment malfunction, despite the precision of his measurements and the consistency of his data, Other drivers began reporting similar experiences on the same stretch of highway, particularly during the anniversary period of the original 1987 accident. The reports followed consistent patterns: backward counting mile markers, radio broadcasts from previous decades, encounters with younger versions of themselves, and temporal distortion that challenged conventional understanding of highway travel. The New Mexico Department of Transportation eventually acknowledged receiving multiple reports of navigation anomalies near mile marker 347, though they attributed the incidents to GPS interference and optical illusions. Rather than admitting the possibility of temporal distortion, Tommy Chen continued his trucking career, but never again traveled U.S. Highway 285 during the anniversary period of the accident that had created its temporal anomaly. He shared his experience with other drivers through trucking forums in CB radio networks, warning them about the dangers of getting trapped in the highway's recursive time loop. His engineering background allowed him to develop theories about how traumatic events might create lasting distortions in the fabric of space-time, particularly in locations where multiple transportation routes intersected and concentrated the flow of human activity and emotion. The stretch of U.S. Highway 285 near mile marker 347 became known among experienced drivers as the backwards mile, a place where time itself could reverse direction and trap unwary travelers in loops of their own. Past experiences: drivers learn to pay attention to mile marker sequences and to be prepared for the possibility that some highways remembered their history in ways that defied conventional physics and challenged the fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and space. Today, Tommy Chen continues to approach trucking with scientific methodology, but he has expanded his understanding to include phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional engineering. He maintains detailed documentation of temporal anomalies reported throughout the trucking industry, hoping to develop a comprehensive theory that might explain how America's highways serve not just as transportation corridors, but as repositories of memory, emotion, and experience that can sometimes spill over into the normal flow of time. His journey through the backwards mile taught him that the road holds more mysteries than any amount of data analysis could ever fully explain. David Park was reported overdue on a route he had driven 200 times. The dispatcher at Mountain West Freight had expected his check-in call by 6:30 a.m., but the silence from his regular Denver to Salt Lake City run stretched through the morning hours without explanation. David's 2021 Freightliner Cascadia was equipped with multiple tracking systems, satellite communication devices, and emergency beacons that should have made prolonged communication blackouts impossible. Yet, according to every electronic monitoring system his company employed, David Park and his truck had simply vanished somewhere along Interstate 17 eastern Utah during the early morning hours of December 15, 2023. At 38 years old, David Park embodied the modern professional truck driver. His safety record was immaculate across 12 years of long-haul trucking with not a single preventable accident, moving violation, or late delivery marking his employment history. He was a family man who called his wife Sarah every evening at exactly 8 p.m. regardless of his location, a ritual that had remained unbroken throughout his career until the night he disappeared. His route planning was methodical and conservative, always building extra time into his schedules to account for weather, traffic, or mechanical issues that might arise during cross-country hauls. The Denver Salt Lake City run represented David's primary freight corridor, a route he had mastered through repetition and careful attention to every mile of highway, every truck stop, and every potential hazard along the 525 meters journey. Interstate 70 through Utah was as familiar to him as his own neighborhood streets. From the dramatic ascent through the Rocky Mountains to the long descent into the high desert country surrounding Grand Junction, Colorado, and finally the straight run across Utah's red rock landscape toward the Wasatch Mountains. That December night had started like hundreds of others. David departed the Denver terminal at 11:15 p.m. with his trailer loaded with consumer electronics, bound for distribution centers in Salt Lake City. Weather conditions were ideal with clear skies and temperatures well above freezing throughout the corridor. His pre-trip inspection revealed no mechanical issues. His fuel tanks were full and his electronic logging device showed him well within hours of service regulations, with plenty of driving time available to complete the journey. David's first indication that something was wrong came at 2:47 a.m. as he approached the small town of Green River, Utah. The green highway signs that should have announced the upcoming exit began displaying different information than he expected. Instead of showing Green River next 3 exits, Ash had seen hundreds of times before, the signs read Goblin Valley State Park, 37 miles, and Capitol Reef National Park, 89 miles, destinations that were located on entirely different highways south of his route. Initially attributing the discrepancy to recent sign updates or his own fatigue-induced misreading, David continued west on what his GPS confirmed was Interstate 70, but the exits that appeared did not match his memory or his road atlas, where he expected to find the familiar Green River truck stop. He encountered an exit for Moonstone Beach Recreation Area, a destination he had never heard of, despite his extensive knowledge of Utah's highway system. David activated his CB radio to contact other drivers who might be traveling the same route. Breaker 119. This is Mountain Runner westbound on I-7, near Green River. Can anyone confirm the current exit information? I am seeing signs for locations that do not match my atlas. The radio remains silent except for static, unusual for a major interstate highway that typically carried steady traffic throughout the night hours. His cell phone showed full signal strength, but could not complete calls to his dispatcher or his wife. Text messages failed to send, despite multiple attempts, and his truck's satellite communication system reported no signal available, despite clear skies that should have provided optimal reception conditions. David was becoming isolated from the outside world, cut off from the communication networks that connected modern truckers to their support systems and safety resources. As David continued west, the highway began to change in subtle ways that challenged his understanding of the route he knew so well. The familiar landmarks disappeared, replaced by rock formations and landscape features he did not recognize. The highway itself seemed to be steering him away from his intended path with gentle curves that gradually altered his heading without his conscious awareness. When he tried to maintain a straight westerly course, the road itself seemed to resist his efforts, creating optical illusions that made straight sections appear curved and forcing him to follow the pavement's lead. David's GPS units began displaying contradictory information. One showed him traveling northwest toward an area labeled Fossil Butte National Monument, while another indicated he was heading southwest toward Zion National Park. The third GPS unit showed no position data at all, its screen displaying only a message that read, "Location services unavailable. Please consult local maps." Yet all 3 devices had been functioning perfectly when he departed Denver, and their satellite reception indicators showed strong signals from multiple satellites. The fuel gauge on David's truck became another source of confusion and growing alarm. Despite having filled his tanks in Grand Junction and driving for less than 2 hours since his last fuel stop, the gauge showed his reserves dropping at an impossible rate. According to his calculations, he should have had at least 150 gall remaining, enough fuel for another 600 miles of travel. Yet, the digital display indicated only 47 gallons in his tanks, suggesting consumption rates that would have indicated major engine problems or fuel leaks that his monitoring systems should have detected. David pulled over at the next exit to investigate the fuel discrepancy, but the exit ramp led not to a truck stop or service area, but to a narrow dirt road that disappeared into darkness beyond the range of his headlights. The exit sign had read services, fuel, food, lodging in standard, interstate formatting, but the reality beyond the pavement was an unpaved track that looked like it had not been maintained for decades. David returned to the highway, increasingly concerned about his situation, but unable to find logical explanations for the anomalies he was experiencing. As the night progressed, David realized that Interstate 70 was actively hunting him, manipulating road signs and exit ramps to lure him away from his intended route toward increasingly remote and dangerous destinations. The highway seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence that could alter its own configuration in real time, creating false exits that led nowhere and phantom destinations that existed only to confuse and trap unwary travelers. David's truck began experiencing mechanical problems that had no apparent cause. His steering became increasingly difficult, as if invisible hands were wrestling for control of the wheel. The brakes would engage randomly, forcing him to slow down at locations where the highway seemed to want him to stop and investigate suspicious exits or roadside features. His cruise control activated itself and began accelerating beyond his set speed, as if the truck were being controlled by external forces that overrode his input commands. The most terrifying moment came when David's truck began driving itself completely. At 4:23 a.m., while he was fighting to maintain control of his steering wheel, his hands were suddenly pushed away from the controls by an invisible force. The truck continued to accelerate and began taking an exit he had not chosen, following a ramp that led toward what appeared to be a vast canyon system filled with abandoned vehicles. David could see dozens of cars, trucks, and a VS scattered throughout the canyon, their rusted hulks glinting in his headlights like a vehicular graveyard. Some of the vehicles appeared recent, while others looked like they had been there for decades, slowly being consumed by the desert environment. He realized he was looking at the final destination of other travelers who had been lured off Interstate 70 by the highway's predatory intelligence trapped in the canyon system and left to die of thirst and exposure, while their vehicles joined the growing collection of automotive bones, fighting against the invisible control that was steering his truck toward the same fate. David made a desperate decision. He reached for his engine controls and shut off the diesel completely, bringing 18 tons of truck and trailer to a gradual stop through momentum alone. The supernatural force that had been controlling his vehicle seemed unable to operate without engine power, and David felt the steering wheel return to his control as the truck came to rest on the shoulder of the exit ramp. David climbed down from his cab and began walking back toward the main highway, abandoning his truck rather than allowing himself to be driven into the automotive graveyard below. The walk back to Interstate 70 took nearly an hour, during which he encountered other abandoned vehicles along the roadside. Their drivers remained still visible in some cases, suggesting that the highway's predatory behavior had been claiming victims for decades. When David reached the main highway, he was surprised to find normal traffic flowing in both directions, with other truckers maintaining regular communication on CB Channel 19. The road signs displayed correct information for Interstate 70 West, and the familiar landmarks he knew so well had returned to their expected locations. His cell phone immediately began working normally, showing dozens of missed calls from his dispatcher and his wife, who had been frantically searching for him. After he failed to make his scheduled check-in, David's rescue came when a Utah Highway patrol trooper found him walking along the interstate near Green River at 6:45 a.m. The officer, Sergeant Martinez, had been part of search operations for missing travelers in the area and was familiar with reports of vehicles and drivers disappearing along certain stretches of remote highway. David's truck was recovered later that morning from the canyon system, its fuel tanks mysteriously full despite his earlier readings showing near empty reserves. The investigation into David's disappearance revealed dozens of similar incidents over the previous decade, the Utah Highway Patrol had documented multiple cases of drivers reporting mechanical malfunctions that forced them to take unplanned exits, GPS failures that led them to remote locations, and encounters with road signs that displayed false information about services and destinations. Most disturbing was the discovery of the vehicular graveyard that David had narrowly escaped, containing the remains of travelers dating back to the 1960s. Geological surveys of the area revealed unusual magnetic anomalies and mineral deposits that could potentially interfere with electronic equipment, providing a partial scientific explanation for the GPS and communication failures experienced by affected drivers. However, the supernatural aspects of David's experience, including the invisible force that had controlled his truck and the highway's apparent ability to alter its own configuration, remained unexplained by conventional investigation methods. David Park returned to trucking after a brief leave of absence, but he never again traveled Interstate 70 through eastern Utah during the overnight hours. When the highway's predatory behavior was most active, he became an advocate for increased safety measures in remote areas, supporting the installation of additional emergency communication systems and regular patrol coverage for stretches of highway where drivers were known to disappear. The Utah Department of Transportation eventually acknowledged the pattern of disappearances and implemented additional safety measures along the affected stretch of Interstate 70, including enhanced lighting, emergency call boxes, and regular monitoring of electronic traffic systems for anomalous readings. Warning signs were installed at truck stops and rest areas, advising drivers to remain on main travel lanes and to report any unusual road signs or exit configurations to authorities immediately. Other truckers began sharing stories of similar encounters with predatory highways throughout the western United States, roads that seemed to actively hunt travelers and lure them away from safe routes toward remote areas where rescue was unlikely. The trucking community developed informal networks for sharing information about dangerous stretches of highway, creating CB channels dedicated to reporting supernatural encounters and unusual mechanical problems that might indicate the presence of hostile road conditions. David's experience on the hungry highway of Interstate 70 served as a reminder that America's transportation network contained more than just routes between cities. Some roads had developed their own malevolent intelligence, feeding on the vehicles and drivers who traveled their lonely stretches during the dark hours when normal traffic was light and rescue was far away. These highways had become predators in their own right, using the trust and familiarity that drivers developed for their routes as weapons to lure them away from safety toward destinations from which few travelers ever returned. Today, experienced truckers know to be suspicious of road signs that do not match their expectations, exits that lead to unfamiliar destinations, and mechanical problems that occur only on specific stretches of remote highway. They understand that some roads are hungrier than others, and that surviving a career in long-haul trucking requires not just mechanical knowledge and safe driving practices, but also the wisdom to recognize when the highway itself has become the enemy. The claims stated there were two identical trucks in the accident. The insurance investigator, Janet Morrison, had processed thousands of commercial vehicle claims during her 23-year career with Pacific Coast Insurance, but she had never encountered a report quite like the one that crossed her desk on the morning of March 18, 2024. According to the California Highway Patrol Incident Report, a collision had occurred on southbound Interstate 15 near Victorville 342 a.m., involving what appeared to be two identical Peterbilt 579 trucks with matching paint schemes, identical company logos, and the same driver registration information. The problem was that only one truck and one driver existed in their system. Rosa Martinez had built her reputation as one of the most reliable owner-operators in Southern California's competitive freight industry. At 33 years old, she had maintained a spotless driving record across 8 years of long-haul trucking with not a single accident, citation, or late delivery marking her professional history. Her distinctive custom-painted Peterbilt 579, featuring a deep burgundy base with gold pin striping and her personal logo Desert Rose Freight, was instantly recognizable at truck stops throughout the Southwest. Rosa took pride in her truck's appearance and performance, investing thousands of dollars in custom details that made her rig unique among the thousands of commercial vehicles that traveled California's highways. The run from Los Angeles to Las Vegas was Rosie's bread and butter, a route she completed 3 times per week, hauling electronics, automotive parts, and consumer goods between distribution centers. Interstate 15 through the Mojave Desert was as familiar to her as her own neighborhood streets. From the steep climb through the Kuan Pass to the long descent into Barstow and the straight run across the desert toward the Nevada border, she knew every truck stop, every way station, and every mile marker along the 270 miles corridor that connected Southern California to the gambling capital of the world. That March night had started routinely enough. Rosa departed the Los Angeles terminal at 11:30 p.m. with her trailer loaded with restaurant equipment, bound for new casinos in Las Vegas. The weather was ideal with clear skies and mild temperatures that made for comfortable driving conditions across the desert. Her pre-trip inspection had revealed no mechanical issues. Her electronic logging device showed her well within hours of service regulations, and her fuel tanks were topped off for the journey ahead. Rosie's first indication that something was wrong came at 1:47 a.m. as she climbed the long grade approaching the Kuan Pass. In her passenger side mirror, she caught a glimpse of another truck following at a distance of roughly 4 miles, its headlight pattern and proportions suggesting a Peterbilt similar to her own. The truck maintained consistent spacing behind her, neither gaining ground nor falling back, matching her speed with precision that suggested an experienced driver who knew how to work traffic in the mountain grades. Initially, Rosa paid little attention to the following truck. Interstate 15 was a major commercial corridor, and it was common to encounter other drivers maintaining similar speeds on familiar routes. But as she crested the pass and began the descent toward Victorville, she began to notice details about the trailing vehicle that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The truck appeared to be an exact duplicate of her own Peterbilt 579, complete with the same burgundy paint scheme and gold pin striping that made her rig distinctive. Rosa reached for her CB radio to contact the following driver. Breaker 19. This is Desert Rose southbound on the 5 near Kuan Pass. Got a burgundy Pete behind me. You running the same equipment? The radio remained silent except for static. Unusual for a major freight corridor that typically carried steady CB chatter throughout the night hours. Rosa tried different channels, but none of the frequencies produced any response from the trailing truck. As Rosa continued down the mountain grade, the duplicate truck began to close the distance between them, eventually settling into a position roughly 50 yards behind her trailer. At this closer range, Rosa could see that the truck was not just similar to her own, but was an exact replica down to the smallest details. The same custom chrome accessories adorned the cab. The same mud flap designs hung behind the rear wheels, and even the same small dent in the passenger door that Rosa had acquired during a minor parking lot incident 2 years earlier was visible in the duplicate vehicle. Rosa's unease turned to genuine fear when she caught sight of the other driver in her mirrors. Behind the wheel of the duplicate truck sat a woman who looked exactly like Rosa herself, wearing the same company uniform shirt and the same distinctive turquoise jewelry that Rosa's grandmother had given her. The doppelganger driver maintained the same posture and driving position that Rosa used, her hands positioned on the steering wheel in identical manner, and her head tilted at the same angle that Rosa unconsciously adopted during long highway runs. The sight of her own face behind the wheel of an identical truck while she was actively driving her own vehicle, challenged Rose's understanding of reality in fundamental ways. She rubbed her eyes, thinking fatigue might be causing hallucinations. But when she looked again, the duplicate truck and driver remained clearly visible in her mirrors. Rosa grabbed her CB radio with hands that had begun to shake, trying different channels and emergency frequencies to contact anyone who might be witnessing the same impossible situation. Mayday, Mayday. This is Desert Rose on Interstate 15 southbound near Victorville. I am being followed by what appears to be an exact duplicate of my truck and myself. Can anyone confirm visual and two identical burgundy Peterbilts in this area? Rose's transmission went unanswered, the radio producing only static despite clear weather conditions that should have provided excellent reception. As Rosa approached the truck stops and service areas near Victorville, she began to encounter other drivers who seemed to recognize both versions of her truck. CB radio chatter picked up with drivers discussing the two Desert Rose trucks and wondering about the unusual convoy formation. Some drivers reported seeing Rose's truck pass them twice within minutes, once heading south and again heading north. Though Rosa had maintained consistent southbound travel throughout the night, the duplicate truck began to exhibit behavior that suggested it was not simply following Rosa, but was actively copying her every action. When Rosa changed lanes to pass slower traffic, the doppelganger truck made identical lane changes at precisely the same moment. When Rosa adjusted her speed to maintain safe following distances, the duplicate vehicle made matching speed adjustments with timing that suggested supernatural coordination and other than human reaction times. When Rosa activated her turn signals to navigate highway interchanges, the mirror truck's signals flashed in perfect synchronization. Rosa pulled into the Flying J truck stop in Victorville, hoping to break their pattern and force some kind of confrontation with her supernatural double. As she maneuvered her truck into a parking space, the duplicate vehicle parked in the adjacent spot, its positioning mirror perfect to Rosa's own truck. Rosa climbed down from her cab and approached the other truck, her heart pounding as she prepared to confront what appeared to be an exact copy of herself. The doppelganger Rosa sat motionless behind the wheel of the duplicate truck, staring straight ahead with the blank expression of someone caught in highway hypnosis. Her clothing, jewelry, and even the small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident were perfectly replicated in the mirror driver. Rosa tapped on the window of the duplicate truck, trying to get the other driver's attention, but received no response. The doppelganger continued to stare forward, her hands remaining positioned on the steering wheel despite the fact that the truck was parked and the engine was turned off. Other truckers in the parking lot began to gather around the two identical vehicles, pointing and taking photographs with their cell phones. The sight of two perfectly matching trucks with identical drivers created a spectacle that drew attention from every driver and truck stop employee in the area. Some drivers claimed they had been listening to CB communications from both trucks simultaneously, with the same voice transmitting from different positions on the highway at the same time. Rosa entered the truck stop restaurant hoping to find witnesses who could confirm what she was experiencing and perhaps provide explanations for the supernatural duplication. The restaurant security cameras, according to the manager on duty, showed only one Rosa Martinez entering the building, despite multiple eyewitness accounts of two identical women being present in the parking lot. The discrepancy between electronic evidence and human observation added another layer of mystery to Rosa's already impossible situation. When Rosa returned to the parking lot 20 minutes later, the duplicate truck had vanished completely. No one had seen it leave, and the parking space where it had been sitting showed no signs that a vehicle had ever occupied the spot. The other truckers, who had been photographing the identical vehicles, found that their cameras and phones contained images of only Rose's actual truck, with no trace of the doppelganger vehicle that they had clearly observed and documented. Rosa completed her run to Las Vegas without further supernatural encounters, but the memory of her mirror driver haunted her throughout the remainder of the journey. She filed a detailed report with her insurance company and the California Highway Patrol, though her account was met with skepticism from investigators who could find no physical evidence of the duplicate truck or driver that multiple witnesses claimed to have observed. The insurance investigators' report became a legend within the industry, not because it documented a verifiable supernatural event, but because it represented the kind of impossible claim that challenged the boundaries between reality and imagination. Janet Morrison's investigation revealed that several other drivers had reported encounters with duplicate versions of themselves on the same stretch of Interstate 15, always during the overnight hours when traffic was light and the desert landscape created optimal conditions for optical illusions and highway hypnosis. The phenomenon became known among truckers as mirror driving, a supernatural occurrence where drivers would encounter exact duplicates of themselves and their vehicles, usually in locations where they had experienced emotional stress or significant life events. Interstate 15 through the Mojave Desert became a focal point for such encounters, possibly due to the combination of isolation, extreme temperatures, and the psychological stress of navigating one of America's busiest freight corridors. Rosa Martinez continued her trucking career, but never again traveled Interstate 15 during the overnight hours when her doppelganger was most likely to appear. She became an advocate for driver mental health programs, understanding that the isolation and stress of long-haul trucking could create conditions where the boundary between reality and hallucination became dangerously thin. Her experience with the mirror driver served as a reminder that the highways of America contained more than just routes between cities. They were repositories of human consciousness, where thoughts, fears, and memories could sometimes take on lives of their own. Other drivers began reporting similar encounters with duplicate versions of themselves throughout the trucking industry, leading to the development of support networks and counseling programs designed to help drivers process supernatural experiences that challenged their understanding of reality. The mirror driver phenomenon became a recognized occupational hazard, acknowledged by insurance companies and trucking associations as a legitimate psychological challenge that required professional intervention and peer support. Today, experienced truckers know to be suspicious of vehicles that match their own too closely, especially during the dark hours when the highway's supernatural forces are most active. They understand that the desert highways of California contain mirrors that reflect more than just light, sometimes showing drivers aspects of themselves that they would prefer to keep hidden in the shadows of their professional lives. The mirror driver serves as a reminder that every trucker carries a shadow self that sometimes emerges on the loneliest stretches of America's highways, where the boundary between the driver and the road itself becomes dangerously blurred. The insurance files remain open on Rosa Martinez's case, not as an unsolved claim, but as a testament to the mysteries that persist on America's highways. Despite advances in technology and scientific understanding, her encounter with her own mirror image behind the wheel of an identical truck continues to serve as a cautionary tale for drivers who spend their careers traveling the same routes, warning them that repetition and familiarity can sometimes create conditions where reality itself becomes duplicated in ways that challenge the very nature of individual identity and existence. She kept saying the bridge was crying. Those were the words that echoed through Dr. Patricia Hawthorne's therapy officiates. She reviewed the session notes from her most unusual patient in 15 years of practice. Michelle Thompson, a 29-year-old long-haul trucker from North Carolina, had been referred for mandatory psychological evaluation after reporting what her employer classified as extreme emotional disturbance during a routine freight run through West Virginia. Michelle's account of her experience on Interstate 77's New River Gorge Bridge had initially seemed like a textbook case of driver fatigue and stress-induced hallucinations. But the consistency of her story and the physical evidence she presented challenged conventional explanations for what had occurred that that foggy October night. Michelle Thompson had always been sensitive to the emotional undercurrents that other people missed or ignored. As a child, she could sense her grandmother's sadness days before the family learned about her terminal diagnosis. In high school, she had avoided certain buildings and locations that felt heavy with unexplained sorrow or anger. When Michelle entered the trucking industry 5 years earlier, she had learned to trust her intuitive feelings about routes and destinations, often choosing alternate paths when her instincts warned her away from seemingly normal highways and truck stops. Her ability to perceive emotional atmospheres had served her well during her trucking career, helping her avoid dangerous situations and problematic customers that other drivers encountered without warning. Michelle had developed an informal reputation among dispatchers for being able to sense trouble before it manifested in obvious ways, leading them to assign her to routes and loads that had proven problematic for other drivers. She approached her supernatural sensitivity as a professional tool, similar to mechanical knowledge or navigation skills that enhanced her effectiveness as a commercial driver. The run from Charlotte, North Carolina to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was supposed to be routine freight work, hauling manufactured goods along well-traveled interstate highways through familiar territory. Michelle had completed similar runs dozens of times over her 5-year career, following Interstate 77 north through the mountains of West Virginia before connecting to Interstate 79 for the final approach to Pittsburgh. The route included crossing the New River Gorge Bridge, a spectacular steel arch span that carried the interstate 876 feet above the New River, creating one of the most dramatic highway crossings in the eastern United States. Michelle had crossed the New River Gorge Bridge numerous times without incident, always appreciating the engineering achievement it represented and the breathtaking views it provided of the rugged West Virginia landscape. The bridge had been completed in 1977 and had become an iconic symbol of the region's natural beauty, attracting tourists and photographers who came to witness its graceful arch spanning the deep gorge, carved by centuries of river flow through ancient Appalachian rock formations. That October night, however, approached the bridge under conditions that immediately triggered Michelle's supernatural sensitivity. A heavy fog had settled into the gorge, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards and creating an atmosphere of isolation and unease that made the familiar crossing feel like a journey into an unknown realm. The fog seemed to muffle sound in strange ways, creating acoustic effects that made Michelle's diesel engine sound distant and hollow, despite the mechanical noise originating just feet from where she sat. As Michelle's Freightliner Cascadia entered the bridge approach at 2:17 a.m., she began to hear what sounded like distant sobbing carried on the fog-laden wind. The sound was faint but unmistakable, resembling the grief-stricken wails of multiple voices crying in unison. Michelle initially attributed the sounds to wind patterns created by the gorge's unique topography, but as she continued onto the bridge span itself, the crying became more distinct and emotionally overwhelming. Michelle had encountered supernatural phenomena before during her trucking career, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of sorrow that began to flood her consciousness. As she crossed the bridge, wave after wave of grief, despair, and anguish washed over her, emotions so powerful that they threatened to overwhelm her ability to maintain control of her 18-ton vehicle. The crying sounds grew louder and more numerous, as if hundreds of voices were weeping simultaneously somewhere in the fog-shrouded darkness below the bridge. Her truck's radio began picking up what sounded like period music and voices from the Civil War era, with faint strains of military songs and spoken words that seemed to drift up from the gorge like audio ghosts from another century. Michelle could make out fragments of conversation that included references to battles, casualties, and military movements that correspond to historical events she remembered from her high school American history classes. The voices carried the cadence and vocabulary of 19th century speech, creating an audio landscape that transported her backwards through time to one of the most tragic periods in American history. Michelle pulled over at the first opportunity, while crossing the bridge, parking her truck at the New River Gorge Bridge overlook to investigate the source of the supernatural experiences that had nearly incapacitated her during the crossing. The overlook provided a spectacular view of the bridge and gorge during daylight hours. But that night, the fog created an impenetrable wall that concealed everything beyond a few yards from her position. The sobbing sounds continued, seeming to rise from the depths of the gorge like the collective grief of souls trapped in eternal mourning. As Michelle stood at the overlook railing trying to process what she was experiencing, she began to perceive visual phenomena that challenged her understanding of the location's history and significance. Through the shifting fog, she caught glimpses of what appeared to be soldiers in Civil War-era uniforms, their ghostly forms moving across the bridge and along the gorge walls in patterns that suggested military formations and battlefield activities. The figures appeared translucent and ephemeral, visible only when atmospheric conditions and lighting created optimal viewing angles. Michelle's supernatural sensitivity allowed her to perceive not just the visual manifestations, but the emotional context that surrounded them. She experienced waves of terror, confusion, and desperate sadness that corresponded to the traumatic experiences of soldiers who had died far from home in one of America's most devastating conflicts. The emotions were not her own, but seemed to be transmitted from the ghostly figure she observed, creating a kind of empathic connection that allowed her to share their final moments of life and their eternal struggle to find peace. Her cell phone, which had been functioning normally throughout her journey, began displaying unusual readings when she tried to document her experience. The camera function captured images that appeared normal when viewed on the phone's screen, but contained anomalous details when examined more closely. In several photographs of the bridge and overlook area, Michelle could make out figures in period clothing that had not been visible to her naked eye when she took the pictures. The figures appeared to be soldiers, some standing at attention, others lying as if wounded or dead, creating a visual record of events that had occurred over 150 years earlier. Michelle's research into the area's history, conducted at a nearby truck stop with Wi-Fi access, revealed the tragic backstory that explained her supernatural encounter. The New River Gorge had been the site of significant Civil War military activity, with Union and Confederate forces fighting for control of the railroad lines and river crossings that were crucial to supply operations in the region. The battles had been particularly brutal, with thousands of soldiers dying and fighting that continued 4 months during 1862 and 1863. The most significant discovery came when Michelle learned about the Battle of New River Bridge, a lesser-known engagement that had resulted in massive casualties on both sides as forces fought for control of a wooden railroad bridge that predated the modern interstate crossing. According to historical accounts, over 800 soldiers had died during the 3-day battle, many of them falling into the gorge when the contested bridge collapsed under the weight of artillery bombardment and desperate infantry charges. The dead soldiers had been buried in hasty graves throughout the gorge area, many without proper identification or notification to their families. Local historians estimated that hundreds of Civil War casualties remained in unmarked graves scattered throughout the region, their sacrifice forgotten by official records but remembered by the land itself. The emotional trauma of their deaths had apparently created a kind of psychic imprint on the location, allowing sensitive individuals like Michelle to perceive the continuing presence of soldiers who had never received proper burial or recognition for their sacrifice. Michelle returned to the bridge overlook with tobacco and wildflowers, traditional offerings that her Cherokee grandmother had taught her to use when honoring the spirits of the dead. Following protocols she had learned for showing respect to ancestral spirits, Michelle conducted a simple ceremony acknowledging the sacrifice of Civil War soldiers and asking for their peaceful rest. As she completed the ritual, the sobbing sounds that had plagued her throughout the night began to subside, replaced by what sounded like distant voices expressing gratitude and relief. The emotional pressure that had threatened to overwhelm Michelle during her bridge crossing lifted completely, allowing her to experience the location's natural beauty without the overlay of supernatural grief that it made her initial encounter so traumatic. The fog began to clear, revealing the spectacular vista of their new river gorge that made the bridge crossing one of the most scenic portions of Interstate 77. The ghostly figures she had observed earlier faded from view, though Michelle sensed their continued presence in the landscape around her. Michelle completed her delivery to Pittsburgh without further supernatural encounters, but her experience on the New River Gorge Bridge had profoundly affected her understanding of the historical weight carried by America's highways. She began researching other locations where major routes cross sites of historical trauma, discovering a network of bridges, mountain passes, and river crossings where sensitive individuals reported encounters with spirits from America's violent past. Her therapy sessions with Dr. Hawthorne became part of a larger study into the psychological effects of supernatural encounters on professional drivers, contributing to research that would eventually lead to support programs for truckers who experienced phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Michelle's detailed documentation of her bridge encounter provided valuable data for researchers studying the intersection of historical trauma, geographic location, and individual psychic sensitivity. The New River Gorge Bridge became a pilgrimage site for Michelle, who returned annually to honor the Civil War soldiers whose presence she had encountered that foggy October night. She worked with local historians and Native American spiritual leaders to establish a memorial ceremony that acknowledged the sacrifice of all who had died in the gorge area, creating a ritual space where the living could pay respects to the dead and help ease their transition to peaceful rest. Other truckers began reporting similar experiences on the New River Gorge Bridge, particularly during foggy condition. When he handed Robert the citation, the paper felt unusually thin and yellowed, like documents that had been stored for decades rather than fresh forms from a current citation book. "You need to be more careful out here, sir," Officer Kowalski said as he prepared to return to his patrol car. "There are others on this highway tonight, and not all of them are as fortunate as you are to receive just a warning about their speed. Some situations are much worse for everyone involved." His words carried a weight of personal experience that suggested he had witnessed traffic tragedies that had profoundly affected his approach to law enforcement. Robert watched in his mirrors as Officer Kowalski returned to his vintage patrol car. The vehicle's emergency lights continuing to flash, fit prepared to depart the traffic stop location. But instead of pulling back onto the highway, the police car seemed to fade gradually from view, its lights becoming dimmer and more distant until they disappeared entirely into the darkness. Robert climbed down from his cab to look for the patrol car, but found no trace of the vehicle or officer who had just issued him a citation. Robert completed his delivery to Kansas City, but the memory of his encounter with Officer Kowalski remained vivid and troubling. The citation appeared legitimate in every detail, complete with case numbers, court dates, and fine amounts that corresponded to Kansas traffic law penalties. However, when Robert attempted to pay the fee online, the court system had no record of the citation number or his traffic stop. Phone calls to the Ellis County Court Clerk's office produced confusion and requests for additional information about the citing officer and the circumstances of the alleged violation. The investigation that followed Robert's report revealed the tragic backstory that explained his supernatural traffic stop. Officer Raymond Kowalski had been a 28-year veteran of the Ellis County Sheriff's Department when he was killed during a routine traffic stop on US Highway 83 in November 1973. According to newspaper archives, Officer Kowalski had been shot and killed by a drunk driver who had panicked during what should have been a simple citation for excessive speed. The killer had fled the scene but was apprehended 3 days later. eventually serving 25 years in prison for the murder. Officer Kowalski had been known throughout Ellis County for his fair but firm approach to traffic enforcement, particularly his focus on preventing the kind of high-speed accidents that claimed multiple lives each year on Kansas highways. His colleagues remembered him as a dedicated professional who genuinely believed that traffic citations could save lives by encouraging drivers to adopt safer behaviors. The location where he had been killed became an informal memorial site where fellow officers would leave flowers and flags on the anniversary of his death. The court records that Robert eventually accessed revealed that Officer Kowalski had issued over 3,000 traffic citations during his career, maintaining detailed records of every stop and consistently following up on court proceedings to ensure that violators faced appropriate consequences for their actions. His commitment to thorough documentation had made him legendary within the Ellis County legal system, with judges and prosecutors praising his attention to detail and professional testimony. Robert's experience was not unique. The Ellis County Sheriff's Department acknowledged receiving multiple reports over the years of traffic stops conducted by officers, matching Officer Kowalski's description. Always on US Highway 83 near the location where he had been killed, the reports followed consistent patterns. Vintage patrol cars with period-appropriate equipment, citations written on yellowed paper with obsolete case numbers, and warnings about dangerous driving conditions that often proved prophetic. Most significantly, drivers who reported encounters with Officer Kowalski's ghost consistently avoided serious accidents in the days and weeks following their supernatural traffic stops. Statistical analysis conducted by the Kansas Highway Patrol revealed that drivers who claimed to have been cited by the phantom officer had accident rates significantly lower than the general trucking population, suggesting that the ghostly encounters had lasting effects on driving behavior and safety awareness. The phenomenon extended beyond individual traffic stops to encompass broader patterns of highway safety in the area. US Highway 83 near Hays, Kansas, experienced lower accident rates and fewer traffic fatalities than comparable stretches of rural highway throughout the state. Local law enforcement attributed the safety record to various factors, including improved road design and increased driver awareness, but veteran officers quietly acknowledged that Officer Kowalski's continuing presence might be providing protection for travelers on the highway where he had given his life. Robert Kim received another traffic citation with the remainder of his trucking career, but he never forgot the lesson taught by Officer Kowalski's ghost. The encounter had reinforced his commitment to safe driving practices and reminded him that law enforcement officers, living and dead, shared a common goal of protecting travelers on America's highways. Robert began carrying information about Officer Kowalski's sacrifice, sharing the story with other drivers as a reminder that traffic safety was a responsibility that transcended individual convenience or schedule pressures. The vintage citation that Officer Kowalski had issued remained in Robert's truck as a talisman and reminder, its yellowed paper and faded ink serving as physical evidence of his encounter with a law enforcement officer who had never stopped patrolling his assigned beat. The document became a conversation starter at truck stops and driver meetings where Robert would share the story of his ghostly traffic stop and the importance of respecting both the living and the dead who work to keep America's highways safe. Other drivers began reporting similar encounters with phantom law enforcement officers throughout the Great Plains states, creating an informal network of supernatural traffic stops that seemed designed to prevent accidents and save lives rather than generate revenue for local jurisdictions. The ghost cops appeared most frequently to drivers who were experiencing fatigue, distraction, or other conditions that increased their risk of causing accidents, providing warnings and citations that served as wake-up calls rather than punitive measures. The Ellis County Sheriff's Department eventually established a memorial fund in Officer Kowalski's honor, using donations from drivers who claimed to have been helped by his ghostly interventions. The fund supported traffic safety education programs and provided scholarships for local students pursuing careers in law enforcement, ensuring that Officer Kowalski's commitment to public safety would continue to benefit future generations of highway travelers and peace officers. Today, veteran truckers traveling US Highway 83 through Kansas keep their eyes open for vintage patrol cars and officers in period uniforms, understanding that an encounter with Officer Kowalski's ghost represents not a threat, but a blessing. They know that some law enforcement officers never truly retire from their duty to serve and protect, continuing their patrols on highways where they had worked and died in service to their communities. The Phantom Speed Trap serves as a reminder that the thin blue line extends beyond life and death, with dedicated officers like Raymond Kowalski maintaining their watch over travelers long after their earthly service has ended. The legend of Officer Kowalski has become part of trucking folklore throughout the central United States, a story that drivers share to honor the memory of law enforcement officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice while keeping America's highways safe. His ghostly patrol car continues to appear to drivers who need guidance, warnings, or simply the reassurance that someone is watching over them during the lonely hours when they navigate the dark highways that connect our nation's communities. The Speed Trap Phantom reminds all who encounter him that traffic safety is a sacred trust between officers and citizens, a responsibility that some take so seriously that they continue to fulfill their duties even from beyond the grave. According to the math, his truck should have run out of fuel 200 meters ago. The fuel receipts scattered across Eleanor Kowalski's kitchen table told an impossible story that challenged everything she understood about diesel consumption, engine efficiency, and basic mathematics. Her husband's meticulously maintained fuel logs showed that his 2019 Volvo VNL had departed Fargo with exactly 187 gallons in its twin tanks, enough fuel for approximately 935 miles of highway travel, his documented consumption rate of 5 meters per gallon. Yet somehow, Stan Kowalski had completed a 1,200 meters run from Fargo to Seattle during a blizzard that should have increased fuel consumption by at least 20%. Arriving with over 50 gallons still remaining in his tanks, Eleanor Kowalski had married into trucking 36 years earlier, when computer logging and electronic monitoring were science fiction concepts that most drivers dismissed as government overreach that would never be implemented in the real world. Over 3 decades of marriage to Stan, she had learned to read fuel receipts, maintenance records, and logbook entries with the precision of an accountant auditing corporate financial statements. Eleanor could calculate fuel consumption rates in her head, predict maintenance cost based on mileage patterns, and identify discrepancies in expense reports that even seasoned dispatchers missed during their reviews. Stan Kowalski represented the old school of professional trucking, a driver who had learned his craft during the era when CB radios were the primary communication tool, and highway navigation required paper atlases and personal memory of routes that changed with construction seasons and weather patterns. At 59 years old, Stan had accumulated over 2 million miles of accident-free driving across 41 states, maintaining detailed paper records that supplemented the electronic systems mandated by federal regulations. His fuel consumption calculations were legendary among his peers for their accuracy, with Stan able to predict his fuel needs within 5 goal-over trips, exceeding 2,000 miles. The December blizzard that struck the northern plains had been one of the worst winter storms in recent memory, with sustained winds over 50 miles per hour and snowfall rates exceeding 2 an hour across North Dakota and Minnesota. Interstate 94 from Fargo to the Montana border had been closed to commercial traffic twice during the storm, with authorities requiring tire chains and restricting speeds to 35 miles per hour when the highway was opened for brief periods between the worst school lines. Stan had departed the Fargo terminal at 11:45 p.m. on December 18th with his trailer loaded with agricultural equipment bound for Seattle. The weather forecast had been ominous, but not prohibitive, predicting heavy snow and strong winds, but temperatures that would remain above the threshold for ice formation that made winter driving truly dangerous. Stan's pre-trip inspection had revealed no mechanical issues. His fuel tanks were completely topped off, and his truck's cold weather systems were functioning perfectly for the challenging conditions ahead. Eleanor's concern began when Stan failed to make his scheduled fuel stop in Bismarck, North Dakota, despite having called her at 2:30 a.m. to report that he was running slightly behind schedule due to reduced speeds, but was making steady progress westward. According to his fuel calculations, Stan should have needed to refuel by the time he reached Bismarck, having consumed approximately 90 gall during the first 180 miles of his journey through increasingly severe weather conditions. Stan's next communication came 12 hours later from Billings, Montana, where he reported that he had successfully navigated the worst of the storm and was preparing to continue toward Seattle. What alarmed Eleanor was Stan's casual mention that his fuel gauges were reading 3/4 full despite having driven over 400 meters through conditions that should have dramatically increased his diesel consumption. Eleanor immediately asked Stan to check his readings, suspecting that ice formation might have affected his gauge accuracy. "Eleanor, I have checked these gauges 5 times in the last hour." Stan's voice crackled through their cell phone connection. "I am showing 234 gall in my tanks, which is impossible based on the distance I have traveled and the conditions I have been driving through. According to my calculations, I should be running on fumes right now, but my truck is acting like I just topped off at the fuel island." Eleanor began reviewing Stan's fuel records from previous winter runs, searching for patterns that might explain the anomalous readings. Stan had documented his fuel consumption meticulously for over 20 years, creating a database that allowed Eleanor to predict his needs based on route, weather conditions, load weight, and seasonal variations in diesel quality. The numbers from his current run defied every established pattern in his historical data. Stan's experience during the blizzard became even more mysterious as he continued to provide updates on his progress, despite driving through whiteout conditions that forced him to maintain speeds well below his normal efficiency range. His fuel consumption appeared to be decreasing with an increasing dot by the time he reached Glendive, Montana. His fuel gauges were reading fuller than when he had departed Fargo, suggesting that his truck was somehow generating fuel rather than consuming it. "Eleanor, this is going to sound crazy, but I think someone or something is adding fuel to my tanks," Stan reported during his evening check-in call. "I have been driving for 18 hours through the worst conditions I have experienced in 40 years of trucking, and my fuel level keeps going up instead of down. I've stopped twice to check for leaks or gauge malfunctions, and everything appears normal except for the impossible readings." Eleanor began researching similar phenomena reported by other truckers, using online forums and CB radio networks to gather information about unusual fuel consumption patterns during severe weather events. Her investigation revealed dozens of accounts from drivers who had experienced mysterious fuel gains during blizzards and other extreme weather conditions, particularly on routes that crossed areas where truckers had died in weather-related accidents. The pattern that emerged from Eleanina's research was both consistent and supernatural in its implications. Drivers consistently reported fuel gains rather than losses during the most dangerous portions of winter storms, often receiving just enough additional fuel to reach safety at truck stops or service areas. The phenomenon occurred most frequently on Interstate 94 between Fargo and Billings, a stretch of highway that had claimed the lives of numerous truckers over the decades who had run out of fuel during blizzards and died of exposure when their trucks became stranded in remote areas. Stan's fuel mystery deepened as he continued west through Montana toward the Idaho border. His truck's electronic monitoring systems confirmed that the diesel engine was operating normally, consuming fuel at expected rates based on engine load and environmental conditions. Yet, his fuel level indicators continued to show gains that defied physical laws governing energy consumption and fuel storage capacity. "I have been checking my fuel tanks every 2 hours since this started," Stan explained during his next call to Elena. "There are no external fuel lines, no hidden tanks, no way for anyone to be adding diesel to my truck while I'm driving. Yet somehow, I am ending this run with more fuel than I started with, despite driving over 1,000 miles through the worst weather conditions imaginable." Elena's investigation led her to contact other drivers' families, seeking similar accounts that might provide explanations for Stan's experience. She discovered that the fuel phantom phenomenon had been reported regularly for over 30 years, always during severe weather events, and always on routes where truckers had previously died due to fuel-related emergencies. The report shared consistent details: fuel gauges that read higher after storm passages, mysterious fuel gains that appeared just when drivers were approaching critical shortage levels, and electronic systems that function normally despite displaying impossible readings. The most significant discovery came when Elena learned about Tommy Kowalski, a driver who had died during a 1987 blizzard on the same stretch of Interstate 94 where Stan had experienced his fuel gains. Tommy Kowalski, despite sharing Stan's surname, was not a known relative, but the coincidence of names attracted Elena's attention as she researched the historical accidents that had occurred during similar weather events. Tommy Kowalski had been a veteran driver with 23 years of experience when he became stranded during a December blizzard that closed Interstate 94 for over 48 hours. His truck had run out of fuel approximately 15 miles east of Glendive, Montana, the same area where Stan had first noticed his impossible fuel gains. Tommy had died of carbon monoxide poisoning while trying to stay warm in his cab, his death serving as a catalyst for improved winter weather protocols and emergency procedures throughout the trucking industry. According to accident reports, Tommy Kowalski had been carrying extra fuel and auxiliary tanks to help other drivers who might become stranded during the storm. His truck had been found with fuel pumping equipment that he had used to assist 3 other drivers before his own tanks ran dry, suggesting that his final act had been helping fellow truckers reach safety at the cost of his own survival. Elena shared this information with Stan at their evening conversation, proposing that Tommy Kowalski's spirit might be continuing his mission of helping stranded drivers by mysteriously replenishing their fuel supplies during dangerous weather events. Stan, despite his lifelong skepticism about supernatural phenomena, found Elena's theory more plausible than any mechanical explanation for his impossible fuel readings. Stan completed his delivery to Seattle with over 70 gallons of fuel remaining in his tanks, an outcome that violated every principle of diesel engine operation and fuel consumption mathematics. His electronic logging devices confirmed that he had traveled 1,247 miles through severe weather conditions, consuming fuel at rates that should have emptied his tanks twice over during the journey. The fuel receipts from Stan's return trip to Fargo provided additional evidence of the supernatural assistance he had received. Despite not purchasing fuel until he reached Minneapolis, Stan's consumption rates returned to normal patterns once he departed the Pacific Northwest, suggesting that the phantom fuel gains had been localized to the specific weather event and geographic area where Tommy Kowalski had died helping other drivers. Elena's documentation of Stan's experience became part of a growing database of supernatural assistance reports that drivers shared through informal networks and online forums. The fuel phantom phenomenon represented one category of highway supernatural encounters that seemed designed to protect drivers rather than frighten them, offering practical help during life-threatening situations rather than creating additional dangers. Stan Kowalski continued his trucking career for 3 more years after his encounter with the fuel phantom, but he never again experienced mysterious fuel gains during severe weather events. He began carrying extra emergency fuel supplies and winter survival equipment, understanding that he could not count on supernatural assistance during future storms. Stan also started monitoring CB radio channels for distress calls from other drivers. Feeling obligated to help stranded truckers in honor of Tommy Kowalski's spirit that had saved his life during the December blizzard, the fuel phantom of Interstate 94 became legendary among drivers who regularly traveled the northern plains during winter months, with many truckers reporting similar experiences of mysterious fuel gains during severe weather events. The phenomenon served as a reminder that some highway spirits continued to serve their fellow drivers long after their earthly careers had ended, providing assistance that could mean the difference between life and death during the most dangerous winter storms. Elena Kowalski established an informal memorial fund for Tommy Kowalski using donations from drivers who believed they had been helped by his spirit to purchase emergency fuel supplies and winter survival equipment for distribution to truckers who could not afford proper safety gear. The fund operated through truck stops and driver organizations along Interstate 94, ensuring that Tommy's legacy of helping fellow drivers continued through both supernatural and practical means. Today, veteran truckers traveling Interstate 94 through North Dakota and Montana during winter storms watch their fuel gauges carefully, not out of concern for running out of diesel, but in hope of witnessing the fuel phantom's continuing mission of mercy. They understand that some drivers never truly retire from their commitment to helping others reach home safely, maintaining their watch over the most dangerous highways. Long after their own journeys have ended, the fuel phantom serves as a reminder that the trucking community extends beyond living with guardian spirits like Tommy Kowalski, ensuring that no driver faces the winter storms alone. James Wright died exactly as the phantom trucker warned he would. The obituary in the Portland Oregonian on November 23, 2023 described a fatal single-vehicle accident on Interstate 5 near Myrtle Creek that had occurred at 3:47 a.m. during clear weather conditions. According to the Oregon State Police investigation, James had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel, allowing his 2020 Mack Anthem to drift across the center line before overcorrecting and rolling down an embankment. What the official report did not mention was the CB radio transmission that had been recorded by 3 other drivers in the area. A message from an unidentified trucker who had predicted James' death with supernatural precision exactly 47 minutes before the accident occurred. At 44 years old, James Wright embodied the rational, non-nonsense approach that characterized successful owner-operators in the modern trucking industry. His mechanical engineering background from Oregon State University had served him well during his 8-year transition from corporate consulting to long-haul freight, allowing him to optimize his routes, maintain his equipment, and maximize his earning potential through data-driven decision-making. James approached trucking as a science rather than an art, dismissing the folklore and superstitions that had defined earlier generations of drivers as outdated relics from a less sophisticated era. James had built his reputation on reliability and efficiency, maintaining delivery schedules that impressed even the most demanding customers, while keeping his operating costs well below industry averages. His 2020 Mack Anthem represented the pinnacle of contemporary trucking technology, equipped with collision avoidance systems, electronic logging devices, and satellite communication equipment that provided real-time monitoring of every aspect of his operation. James trusted technology over intuition, believing that proper equipment and scientific methodology could eliminate the uncertainties and dangers that had plagued previous generations of truckers. The Portland to Los Angeles run was James' primary freight corridor, a route he had completed over 150 times without incident during his 4 years as an owner-operator. Interstate 5 through Oregon and Northern California was familiar territory. From the urban complexities of Portland's freight distribution networks to the mountain grades of the Siskiyou Pass and the long descent through California's Central Valley toward Los Angeles, James had documented every mile of the route, creating detailed performance profiles that allowed him to predict fuel consumption, travel times, and maintenance needs with remarkable accuracy. That November night had started with James' standard pre-trip inspection and route planning protocols, systematic procedures that had never failed to identify potential problems before they became roadside emergencies. His trailer contained high-value electronics bound for distribution centers in Los Angeles, cargo that required climate control and careful handling throughout the 963 miles journey. Weather forecasts showed clear conditions along his entire route, with temperatures well above freezing and no precipitation expected until after his scheduled arrival in Southern California. James departed the Portland terminal at 10:30 p.m., his electronic logging device showing him well within hours of service regulations and his fuel tanks topped off for the journey ahead. His truck's diagnostic systems reported all parameters within normal ranges, and his GPS showed the standard route south on Interstate 5 with no construction delays or traffic incidents that might affect his schedule. Everything about the run suggested routine freight work that would conclude with an on-time delivery and another successful completion of his primary corridor. The first supernatural warning came at 1:15 a.m. as James passed through the small town of Cottage Grove, Oregon. His CB radio, typically quiet during overnight hours on familiar routes, suddenly crackled to life with a transmission from an unidentified driver whose voice carried an odd quality that seemed to echo from a great distance despite the clarity of the signal. Northbound Mac anthem with the reefer trailer. "This is Highway Angel on your back door. You need to pull over and get some rest, driver. You're not going to make it past Myrtle Creek tonight if you keep pushing like this." The transmission was directed specifically at James, referencing his exact truck model and trailer configuration. Despite the fact that he had not been communicating with other drivers or identifying his equipment on the radio, James immediately checked his mirrors for other trucks that might be following him, but saw only empty highway stretching behind his trailer in the darkness. His CB radio showed strong signal strength, but no indication of nearby transmitters that could account for the clarity and specificity of the warning he had received. James responded to the transmission, hoping to identify the source of the mysterious advice. "Highway Angel, this is Mountain Runner southbound near Cottage Grove. I do not show any trucks in my area, and I am feeling alert and well rested. Can you provide your location and equipment description?" James' response produced only static despite optimal atmospheric conditions for CB radio propagation and the powerful antenna system installed on his truck. The second warning came 30 minutes later as James began the descent toward Roseburg through the mountainous terrain of Douglas County. This time, the phantom trucker's voice carried an urgency that had been absent from the earlier transmission, suggesting increasing concern about James' continued progress southward. "Mountain Runner, this is Highway Angel again. I am showing you weaving in your lane and making speed corrections that suggest micro sleeps. You need to understand that if you do not stop for rest within the next hour, you will have a fatal accident at mile marker 108 near Myrtle Creek at approximately 3:47 a.m. This is not a guest driver. This is what happens if you do not change course." The specificity of the prediction startled James, who immediately checked his truck's monitoring systems for any indication of erratic driving patterns. His electronic logging device showed steady speeds and consistent lane positioning with no alerts for sudden corrections or attention lapses that might suggest drowsiness or distraction. James felt alert and focused, his caffeine intake carefully, time to maintain optimal alertness throughout the night shift. James had always been skeptical of supernatural claims, attributing ghost stories and phantom encounters to driver fatigue, stress, and the psychological effects of spending long hours alone in moving vehicles. His engineering background had taught him to seek rational explanations for unusual phenomena, and he initially dismissed the CB warnings as pranks from other drivers, using high-power radio equipment to broadcast from distant locations. Highway Angel, this is Mountain Runner requesting your actual location and business name for my logbook records. I do not appreciate predictions about accidents, and I am reporting this incident to appropriate authorities. James' response reflected his irritation with what he perceived as unprofessional conduct that violated the informal protocols governing CB radio communications among commercial drivers. The third and final warning came at 2:55 a.m. James passed through Roseburg and began the approach to the Myrtle Creek area, where the phantom trucker had predicted his death would occur. The voice on the CB radio now read a tone of desperate urgency, as if the unseen driver understood that time was running out to prevent the tragedy he had foreseen. Mountain Runner, you have 52 minutes to save your own life. Pull over at the next truck stop and sleep for 4 hours. Call your wife Sarah and tell her you love her. Do not attempt to make your scheduled delivery time. The load is not worth your life, and your family needs you more than your customers need their freight on time. The mention of James's wife by name sent a chill through him that challenged his rational worldview. Sarah Wright was not involved in James' trucking business, and her name appeared nowhere in his commercial documentation or CB radio protocols. Only someone with access to his personal information could have known about Sarah. Yet, the phantom trucker was providing details that should have been impossible for a stranger to possess. James reached for his cell phone to call Sarah, thinking that speaking with her might help him understand how the mysterious CB transmissions had obtained personal information about his family. But his phone showed no signal strength despite being in an area with excellent cellular coverage, and his satellite communication system reported service temporarily unavailable, despite clear skids that should have provided optimal reception conditions. As James approached mile marker 108, the exact location where the phantom trucker had predicted his accident would occur, he began to experience the micro-sleeps and attention lapses that the mysterious voice had warned about. Despite his earlier alertness, James found his eyelids becoming heavy and his concentration wavering in ways that suggested the onset of dangerous fatigue. His truck began making small steering corrections that he did not consciously initiate, suggesting that he was indeed experiencing the impaired driving patterns that the highway angel had detected through supernatural means. At 3:42 a.m., 5 minutes before the predicted accident time, James made a crucial decision that would determine whether the phantom trucker's prophecy became reality. Despite his skepticism about supernatural warnings and his commitment to maintaining his delivery schedule, James pulled into the Myrtle Creek truck stop and brought his Mack Anthem to a complete stop in the parking area. James climbed down from his cab and walked around his truck, trying to clear his head and assess his actual level of fatigue versus the artificial tiredness that seemed to be affecting him as he approached the predicted accident location. The cool Oregon air and physical movement helped him realize that he was indeed more tired than he had acknowledged, and that continuing to drive without rest would have put him at genuine risk for the kind of micro-sleep accident that the phantom trucker had described. His CB radio crackled one final time as he prepared to secure his truck on rest for several hours before continuing his journey. Mountain Runner, this is Highway Angel. You made the right choice, driver. Your family will see you again because you chose to listen. Some warnings come from places you cannot understand, but that does not make them less important. Drive safe and remember that the highway watches over its own. James attempted to respond to the final transmission, hoping to learn more about the identity of the mysterious highway angel who had potentially saved his life. But his CB radio produced only static, and no amount of channel scanning could locate the phantom trucker, who had provided such specific and accurate warnings about the dangers ahead. James slept for 6 hours at the Myrtle Creek truck stop, awakening, refreshed, and alert for the remainder of his journey to Los Angeles. His delivery arrived 8 hours later than originally scheduled, but his customers accepted the delay without penalty when James explained that he had stopped for mandatory rest to ensure safety. The delay cost James several hundred in performance bonuses, but he understood that the financial loss was insignificant compared to the life that had been saved through supernatural intervention. James' investigation into the identity of the highway angel led him to discover the tragic story of Marcus Thompson, a veteran driver who had died in a fatigue-related accident at mile marker 108 near Myrtle Creek in 1996. Marcus had been driving for over 30 years when he fell asleep at the wheel during a routine run from Portland to Los Angeles, his truck rolling down the same embankment where James would have died if he had ignored the phantom trucker's warnings. According to accident reports, Marcus Thompson had been known throughout the trucking community for his willingness to help other drivers, particularly those who were struggling with the physical and psychological demands of long-haul freight. His CB handle had been Highway Angel, and he had made it his personal mission to monitor radio channels for drivers in distress, offering advice, assistance, and encouragement to truckers who were facing dangerous situations. Marcus' death had been particularly tragic because he had been trying to complete a delivery to support his daughter's college tuition, pushing himself beyond safe limits in order to maintain the income that his family needed for educational expenses. His sacrifice had served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing financial pressures over safety requirements, leading to industry-wide discussions about schedules, compensation, and driver welfare. James Wright's encounter with Marcus Thompson's spirit transformed his understanding of trucking from a purely technological profession into something that encompassed human connections that transcended life and death. He began monitoring CB channels more carefully during his runs, listening for other drivers who might be struggling with fatigue, stress, or dangerous driving conditions that could lead to accidents. The experience also changed James' approach to supernatural encounters reported by other truckers, leading him to document and investigate similar stories of phantom warnings, ghostly assistance, and prophetic dreams that had helped drivers avoid accidents. His engineering background allowed him to approach these phenomena with scientific methodology while remaining open to explanations that extended beyond conventional understanding of cause and effect. James established a memorial fund in Marcus Thompson's honor, using donations from drivers who believed they had been helped by the Highway Angels' continuing presence to support driver fatigue, awareness programs, and family assistance funds for truckers who died in preventable accidents. The fund operated through truck stops and driver organizations along Interstate 5, ensuring that Marcus' legacy of helping fellow drivers continued through both supernatural and practical means. Other drivers began reporting encounters with the Highway Angel throughout the Pacific Northwest, creating an informal network of supernatural assistance that seemed designed to prevent fatigue-related accidents on dangerous stretches of highway. The reports followed consistent patterns: CB radio warnings about specific hazards, accurate predictions of accident locations and times, and mysterious knowledge of personal details that should have been impossible for strangers to possess. James Wright continued his trucking career for 7 more years after his encounter with the Highway Angel, but he never again dismissed supernatural warnings or ghost stories shared by other drivers. He understood that some truckers never truly retired from their mission of helping fellow drivers reach home safely, maintaining their watch over America's most dangerous highways long after their own journeys had ended. The Highway Angel of Interstate 5 became a protective presence that drivers throughout the Pacific Northwest learned to respect and appreciate. Understanding that Marcus Thompson's spirit continued to monitor CB channels for truckers in distress decades after his own death, his phantom warnings served as reminders that the trucking community extended beyond the living with guardian angels, like Marcus, ensuring that drivers who listened to supernatural guidance could avoid the tragic fate that had claimed his own life. Today, Experienced truckers traveling Interstate 5 through Oregon keep their CB radios tuned to Channel 19, listening carefully for warnings from the highway angel, who continues to protect drivers from the fatigue-related accidents that remain known. Of the industry's most persistent dangers, they understand that some voices on the radio carry wisdom from beyond the grave, offering guidance that can mean the difference between life and death for drivers who are willing to listen to warnings that come from places they cannot fully understand. The final exit that James Wright avoided serves as a reminder that death, omens, and prophetic warnings should be taken seriously by drivers who encounter supernatural phenomena on America's highways. The highway angel's continuing presence demonstrates that some truckers take their responsibility for fellow drivers so seriously that they maintain fire protective watch after their earthly careers have ended, ensuring that the highways they once traveled remain safer for all who follow in their tire tracks.